Well, thank you, Beth Ann. I'd like to start by saying that I think Dan was a bit modest a few minutes ago when he said that some of the research that he'd been seeing and some of the activities went over his head. I think that's incorrect for a couple reasons. First of all, he's pretty tall. I mean, to get that stuff over his head, that'd be difficult, right? But second of all, I think that Dan... What? Oh, sorry. I think that Dan and Claire and Mary of the foundation have been exceptionally smart in recognizing that autism is so complex and so difficult to understand that it really takes teams of people, and in this case, teams of people across universities. So they funded the Marino Autism Research Institute as one of the first sort of integrations across private universities to bring multidisciplinary faculty at both universities together in an attempt to form a great team to make contributions in solving the problems posed by autism. I've now gone on to the University of California and the Mind Institute, which is another team. And I think throughout the nation and throughout the world, we've begun to realize that no one science, no one person, no one study is going to do it for us. We really have to put our heads together and try to solve what is a very difficult puzzle to solve. What I'm going to try to do in the remaining 21 minutes now is give you an overview of my sense of the field in terms of the nature of this disorder and some of the issues that are particularly important to think about vis-a-vis this conference when we're trying to understand environmental gene, environmental neurobiology, impacts on autism. We really want to know something about the phenotype, the behavioral presentation, what might be central, what might not, some differences in prevalence in order to really hone our hypotheses and our research. So I'm going to try to give you a sense of why I've just said that. First of all, I think it's really important for people to understand where we've come. I started in 1981, probably about the same time that Wendy Stone started and a few other people, and the field has come a long way in that period of time. One example of this is that in 1980 through 1987, the diagnosis of autism was based on 5 criteria. And even though we knew the disorder was focused on the social disturbance, there was only one criteria on which we based the diagnosis that referred to social behavior, and that was a pervasive lack of responsiveness to others. That is, in part, where the larger rubric of pervasive developmental disabilities came from. Now, the problem there was that it was completely uninformed. You can see a little bit farther down that in 1978, Pat Hallen at the Maudsley, which was one of the prime centers of research in autism at the time, reviewed the entire field of what we knew about the social nature of autism, and she reviewed it in 7 pages and 39 citations, 6 of which were empirical. We had absolutely no understanding of the social nature of autism through much of the 1980s. Then she did another review, and in that 1980s period, people started to apply what we know about infant development, because autism is an early onset disorder, and we began to understand something of the specifics about the behavioral expression of the disorder, so that by 1986, that was a much larger paper with many more empirical citations. But the point being is that for a long time we've labored under this assumption, or we did labor under the assumption, that autism is a pervasive disorder, a pervasive lack of responsiveness to others. Now, unfortunately, that description is maintained somewhat in the prototype that we all have of autism. But equally unfortunate is the variability in autism is such that that prototype only fits a minority of children. So by 1994 and through 2000, both in the United States and in the International Classification of Disease, there was a wholesale shift from pervasive lack of responsiveness to actually talking about different categories of disturbance, impairments in social and communication, repetitive behaviors, etc. Now here are the 4 criteria that we now use for the social behavioral component of autism. One, and perhaps most prominent, is failure to develop peer relations. But failure to develop peer relations is something that we can only really appreciate in a child once they start getting into peer relations, which is around age 4 or 5, typically, sometimes 3. That's a little too late since this is an early onset disorder. So what we were doing in the 80s and 90s was trying to come up with early markers, and that work continues today in the sibling studies. And in the NICU studies, which I'll talk about in a minute. One of the things that we were able to understand was that we could define autism in terms of something that we described as a lack of spontaneous seeking to share enjoyment or interests. And we could do this really reliably with early behavioral measures, and it also involved an impairment in nonverbal behaviors and a lack of social emotional responsivity. Now, 22 minutes can't describe that very well at all. So let me show you some pictures from 1986 of some of the studies or some of the data that led to that. So here's if I can find my cursor and show you this again because it probably was already active. A child with Down syndrome, he activates a toy, he shares his interest with me, and he shares his interest with his parents. When we tested young children with mental retardation, they would do that over and over and over again, many times, children as young as 30 months of age. When we tested children with autism, they would be very engaged with the toy, smile at the toy, look at the toy, but they wouldn't share their experience of the toy. And that one behavior in our early studies discriminated children with autism from children with mental retardation from typical children at a sensitivity and specificity of 96%. And that was replicated time and time again. So that's one of the reasons why we had some success in changing the diagnosis, because we fell upon some measures that really seemed to capture an essence of the disorder. Now you'll note that the essence hinges on some sort of attentional function, and I'll talk about that. Now one thing else we noticed, though, was that children with autism were quite socially responsive. At least many of them were quite socially responsive, showed a lot of eye contact, showed a lot of social behaviors in specific situations. So here's a child with autism responding to a tickle turn-taking game, sounds silly, but making eye contact and requesting. So a pervasive lack of responsiveness was not a good descriptor, because that child is responding quite well. And so it's taken us a long time to really be able to define the social phenotype of autism. That's still in progress. And we have to tie our science, our biological science, our epidemiological science, our genetic science back to that to try to link the processes, the biological processes, to what we are increasingly understanding as cardinal behavioral symptoms of the disorder. One other thing that we understood at this period of time was that autism was not a disorder of attachment. Again, there was no pervasive lack of responsiveness because they showed attachment to their parents. And that was fairly evident to us by the late 80s. We also saw that, that children with autism engaged in imitation, responded to imitation. Actually, some of them could engage in social learning. So we had a fairly good idea that the pervasive lack of responsiveness was not a very appropriate way to think about it. With the new diagnostic system in place in 1994, actually 1992 in Europe in the ICD-8, 1994 in the United States, things began to change. We don't know how much of an impact the change in diagnosis has had, but we do know that there's been a tremendous increase in the prevalence of autism. That's why we're here today, and by bringing environmental hypotheses, epidemiological science, and the combination of those with neuroscience together, we hope to better understand why there's this sharp increase in prevalence. But one thing that we do have to understand is how much of that is attributable to diagnostic differences. Now, one of the big arguments that it can't be attributed to diagnosis is that we typically see the increase in young children, but we don't know whether the increase also shows up in older children. If it was diagnostic, it should be showing up in older children. And unfortunately, we have very little epidemiological data like that. These are data from Miami where we thought we were seeing some changes in older children, but it's only one study. So we need to understand how these, when we have a change in prevalence, does that change immediately impact all age groups or is only manifest in the youngest? because that's where we would expect to see the new environmental effects. So when we think about environmental effects, we think about changes in diagnosis, we think about changes in environment and their interaction in some of the new immunological models of autism, which might be discussed by some of my colleagues from UC Davis and other people here, are some of the more exciting new thoughts about autism. There's also the notion of a sort of mating, that with greater ability to move around the world, to interact with more people, different combinations of people are coming together, and that gives rise to some change in the mixing of the gene pool, which contributes to autism. One of the more interesting facets that I've just learned about in the last month is that, you can see the change in prevalence of autism in the neonatal intensive care units. I'm presenting data here from the New York Developmental Disabilities Institute at Staten Island, but the same, almost exactly the same data have recently been reported by Ed Cook at the University of Illinois in Chicago, and that is that you see a change in the prevalence of autism in infants who are stressed by being very low birth weight. And one of the more interesting things is that you see the odds ratio here of 1 in 74 in the latter cohort in this fairly large NICU sample of 2,153, actually plus 13, and 1,690 plus 23 that Bernie Carmel and Judy Gardner and others have done. So this is something new. There's a higher prevalence of autism all of a sudden in the NICUs. Well, that's very interesting, and we need to understand that. Another thing that we're going to need to understand, and this is not at all clear yet, but one of the things that seems to be occurring is that as the prevalence is changing, proportionally, we're seeing more higher functioning children. That's actually not a very good term, higher functioning children. So perhaps we should say it this way. Proportionately, we're seeing more children with autism without mental retardation. When I started, we thought that only about 25% of children with autism, their outcome occurred without mental retardation. Here, what I'm showing you is, you can't really compare these bar graphs because they're on different scales, but here you can see the general increase in prevalence, and here you can see the relative or proportional increase in higher functioning children or children without mental retardation. These are data from Eric von Bahn, 2005. I took the 22 studies that had IQ data and also had sample sizes of 10,000, and there's a significant difference there. Now we're talking about 44% of children with the designation of autism, having autism without mental retardation. What's going on there? What's the implication of that? Why is that happening? If environment is driving it or biology is driving it, why is it driving it in the higher functioning children? Is this true at all? This is just one analysis of data that I happened to do a year ago. But look at this. Here's data from the Atlanta Metropolitan Surveillance Study. We now have, as Greg Neuschafer will talk about, a pretty good surveillance system around the country. The data is slow to come out because surveillance is so labor intensive that you're always collecting the data and it's hard to get it out. But at any rate, here's some data that just came out last year where they looked at all cases in the Atlanta metropolitan area. These are medical case record studies, and they identified 601 children. In that sample, 42% of them were children without mental retardation. So when you go to the CDC webpage now, it says the co-occurrence of mental retardation with autism is 60 to 40%, meaning the CDC is saying that it's possible that 60% of children with ASD are children without mental retardation. So why is that happening? And I brought this up at some meetings at NIH recently, and I'm bringing it up here because I think this is a phenomenon that we have to verify. I'm not sure it's true, but if it is true, it has implications for our modeling in terms of environmental effects on the prevalence of autism. One of the more interesting things that the CDC also reported was that among the kids with no mental retardation, there was a 2.7 odds ratio that their parents had more than 16 years of education, meaning higher education among parents was linked to the tendency for autism to appear without mental retardation. Now, that doesn't mean it always happens. That was only 76 cases out of the 249. But still, a 2.7 odds ratio is a very strong finding. Now let's go back to the Bernie Carmel data from the Staten Island Disabilities Institute, or the New York State Disabilities Institute. And what did they find? Well, they found that in their NICU sample, the children with autism had moms with higher education. So these are the kind of links that you can begin to see or at least explore when lots of people are doing research on autism. A higher rate, proportion of higher functioning children, more highly educated moms going into the NICU, which is something that's been happening over the years, education being related to autism in neonatal intensive care units. I think that we're finally have enough people doing enough work that we're beginning to see little key elements that may help us sort things out. Another important thing to understand about autism, and that has been a puzzle since I began, and certainly I have no real sense of how to explain this, is differences in course of onset. There's at least two basic differences. One is a course of onset where parents have fairly early inclinations and the child is giving us behavioral indications of problems starting somewhere around 12 months, and it's a fairly constant progressive movement towards clearly presenting with autism. Another group of children seems to develop, according to parent report and videotape, retrospective videotape information, seems to progress moderately well, no real clear signs, until somewhere between 12 and 18 months, and then shows a regression. Some of those children, or a higher rate of those children, often have seizure disorders, but we still don't understand the total numbers of children showing each course and why these courses are different, but it does suggest that there's something in the second year of life and the first year of life, critical periods, where development is going awry, and that's part of what autism is. Now, what about that higher functioning group, or the group without mental retardation? I don't think we have any data on the course of development of that group of children. And if that's 40% of the children, that means there's a whole group that we aren't really capturing all that early in many of our studies, which is an interesting issue. Another part of the presentation of autism that's really critical to understand and consider in all our research is comorbidity. Autism often occurs both in terms of the broader phenotype in family members, but within the children themselves, in combination with a variety of other forms of problems. And two of the most common are anxiety and ADHD. And I know this to be the case because we have a grant, part of the MARI system at the University of Miami, to look at higher functioning children with autism. But most of those children come in either with high rates of anxiety or high rates of ADHD. And we're looking at sort of neurocognitive functions and behavioral functions, and we have a hard time knowing when we see differences whether to attribute it to autism or attribute it to anxiety or attribute it to ADHD. So it confounds our ability to interpret the data. Well, the same thing is true for all research, because all samples of children with autism, there's comorbidity present. This is really important to understand from the genetic, the neurological, the cognitive, and the epidemiological level. So that when we find a specific association between a cognitive or a neurological or a genetic or an environmental factor, that's good. We then need to take the next step to say, we know that this is specific to autism because we've ruled out that it's not associated with some of the comorbid features of autism. We've got to make that differentiation, and there's enough people working in the field to begin to do that. One of the reasons that this is really important is that autism is not alone in showing a high rate of increase in diagnosis over the last 2 decades. ADHD has shown not the same rate, but a very high rate of increase. And as you can see, the Olson data is coming right out of NIH. That's basically an intramural study, probably the best one there, and they're talking about a shift from basically 1 in 100 to 3.4 in 100. So there's an increase there. So what's that increase about? Is that just diagnostic, or is that environmental? Are the environmental effects that are relating to ADHD contributing to autism? We'll have to tease that apart. Other disorders, and the reason that I'm picking on bipolar and ADHD is that at least among the higher functioning children, there's often a differential diagnostic problem between these diagnoses. High functioning children with autism often get labeled ADHD. They sometimes get labeled bipolar. Both of those have shown relatively strong growth. We need to understand not only the growth in autism, but we need to understand the development and the change in prevalence in allied disorders so that we can tease apart the specific from non-specific factors. Social subtypes. You know, since Lorna Wing, a brilliant woman in England, described autism and said she actually knew that it wasn't a pervasive lack of responsiveness to others by 1979, because she said there are different subtypes and they act very differently. There's the aloof subtype that looks like the classic form of autism that we're describing in our diagnostic system, but then there's a very different form, this active group that really initiates interactions, but they don't have the skills to support them, so they initiate interactions that fail or initiate interactions that are maladaptive. Others have gone on to replicate that time and again. There are different behavioral styles of the social expression of autism. And we really need to understand them. There's very little research on that. But it probably means that there are different neurological, genetic factors that are contributing to differences in expression. One of the things that we've been doing is just looking at all of us vary along behavioral activation and inhibition. Some of us are more active, some of us are more comfortable in social situations, some of us like to get rewards, some of us are less active, we're not so interested in rewards, we're more internal and withdrawn. That tends to vary in terms of certain frontal processes. Well, we've used those frontal processes and found that children with autism vary in them. And they vary meaningfully, such that children who look like they have frontal processes associated with behavioral activation show fewer symptoms. Children who look like they have frontal processes associated with inhibition, they have reports of higher symptoms. But most importantly, this type of general dimension of individual difference sets up by 10 months. And in 2 studies, we've used the autism diagnostic interview, and we've asked parents, when did you first think there were symptom onset for your children? And parents of children who have left frontal asymmetry, which is equivalent to behavioral activation, say they thought their children had symptom onset at 40 months in a study by Courtney Burnett, who's here somewhere. But the children with right frontal asymmetry, behavioral inhibition, their parents said they had symptom onset at 22 months. Now, never believe one study, because this stuff is really hard to do and the variability in autism is high. So we've done the study again with a different sample, and we found the same means that Courtney did on that measure, but it wasn't quite significant. But another measure from the Autism Diagnostic Inventory says symptoms of autism were clear at 36 months, or symptoms were present, but it was not clearly symptoms of autism at 36 months. And there we find the same thing. Those behavioral activation children, left frontal children, had symptoms that were not clear of autism at 36 months to a greater degree, not each and every one of them. And the children with behavioral inhibition, right frontal functioning, had parent report of symptoms that were clear of autism at 36 months. So that means that when we think about individual differences in autism, we have to think about the left side of this sort of figure. Is that right? Left, yes. In which there's biological contributions to autism, and the variability in those constellations of biological factors give rise to individual differences. But then autism also interacts with human nature, the dimensions of individual differences that we're all prone to, and individual differences in course, onset, and symptom expression probably result from those interactions as well, complicating the picture. But also, with that knowledge, we can begin to look at some of these broader individual difference domains and better understand what's going on. I've just had my red light come on, so I'm going to just skip ahead. I'm not going to talk to you about attention, except to say this. Attention is a problem for children with autism. One of the things we're beginning to understand is that it might be a preference. 2 studies have come out which show that children with autism have a preference for black and white gradients that lasts longer than it should. That should disappear at 2 months. It looks like it's carrying on to 6 months in these children or longer. And that one kind of attentional disturbance could offset the whole developmental system of attention and social attention in a major way. The fact that we have 2 studies, one a sibling study, one a NICU study, finding that gives us hope that we can come up with early behavioral identifiers of autism. Thank you.